The night of the Luna ceremony was cold, even for the mountains. Mara Eldon stood at the far edge of the crowd, wrapped in a plain gray cloak that nobody had given her, and nobody would miss. Around her, pack members dressed in white and gold pressed forward, straining to see the stage where King Aldrich Voss stood tall beneath the moon. Torchlight caught the edges of his dark crown. His jaw was set, his eyes were forward. He looked exactly like a king was supposed to look, strong, certain, and completely unreachable. Mara watched him place the Luna crown on Seraphine Calloway's head. She watched Seraphine smile the way a person smiles in a painting, perfect, still, and without warmth. She watched the crowd cheer, and then she turned around and walked away into the dark, because she had already decided, somewhere between the third and fourth drumbeat of the announcement 3 weeks ago, that she would not cry in front of people who never once thought to look at her. She cried later, alone in the woods, sitting against the roots of an old tree, with her knees pulled to her chest. She cried the way people cry when they are not performing sadness, but actually living inside it, quietly, without stopping, for a very long time. Then she wiped her face, picked up the small bag she had packed, and started walking east. 3 years before that night, Mara and Aldrich had been something neither of them had a name for. She was the daughter of a disgraced warrior, who had made too many enemies and not enough alliances. She lived in the outer edges of pack territory, in a small house that let in the wind, and she spent most of her mornings gathering herbs that the pack healers would take without thanking her. She was used to being invisible. She had learned, early, that invisibility was sometimes the safest thing a girl with no status could wear. Aldrich was a prince who hated closed rooms. He had escaped the palace the same way every week, through a side gate near the old stables, across the lower field, and into the woods where no one followed, because no one believed a prince would actually go somewhere so ordinary. He was being trained for the throne by advisors who spoke only in strategy and duty and legacy. He was exhausted by words that had no feeling in them. The first time he saw Mara, she was arguing with a rabbit. The rabbit had gotten into her herb basket, and she was explaining to it, in a very serious voice, exactly why this was unacceptable behavior. Aldrich stopped walking, he listened, and then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed. A real laugh, not the polished kind he produced for court functions. She spun around, startled, and the rabbit escaped. She was furious. He apologized. She told him his apology was not going to replace her lavender. He went back the next day with 3 bundles of lavender he had absolutely no idea how to find, and had spent 2 hours locating. She looked at the lavender, then at him, and said, "You look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" No one had ever spoken to him like that. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Over months, without either of them deciding to, they built something quiet and strong between them. She told him about her father, who had loved her fiercely and failed her publicly. He told her about his, who had loved the kingdom first, and his son somewhere after that. They talked about things that mattered, not politics or bloodlines, but fear and loneliness, and the strange weight of being a person in a world that keeps asking you to be something else. The bond between them was not something they discussed. It simply existed, like weather, like gravity, a low, steady pull that made the world feel slightly more possible when the other person was nearby. When Aldrich's father died, and the crown fell onto his shoulders, everything changed in a single week. The royal council, 5 old men who had been running things quietly from behind every throne for decades, called Aldrich into the great hall, and told him, without softness, that he needed to choose a Luna within the year, noble blood, political value, alliance potential. They gave him a list of approved names. Seraphine Calloway was at the top. Aldrich sat in his private quarters that night for hours. He thought about Mara, the way she listened, the way she laughed, the way she had once pressed her hand briefly against his chest when he told her about the day his father died, not saying anything, just acknowledging that the pain was real. He thought about what it would mean to bring her into the palace, what the council would say, what would happen to a woman with no status and no alliances, in a world that used both as weapons. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself many things that night. 3 weeks later, the announcement drums sounded across the kingdom, and Mara heard his choice the same way everyone else did. She walked east for 11 days before she found Elder Thessaly. Or, more accurately, Elder Thessaly found her, stepping out of a small stone cottage at the edge of the eastern provinces, with a cup of tea in one hand, and an expression that suggested she had been expecting someone to show up eventually. She just hadn't been sure when. Thessaly was old in the way that certain mountains are old, not fragile, just deeply, quietly permanent. She had served as advisor to 3 Alpha Kings before she decided she was done advising people who did not listen. She had come east and built a life among the outer packs, the ones that the kingdom taxed heavily and thought about lightly. She looked at Mara standing on her path with a worn bag and red eyes and said, "You look like someone who has just discovered the difference between what she was told she was worth and what she actually is. Come in, the tea is already made." Mara stayed. The years that followed were not easy, and she did not want them to be. She trained physically. Thessaly knew fighting techniques that the royal guard had never seen, developed over generations by packs that had learned to survive without protection from anyone. She studied the old wolf laws, the original ones, that the royal council had quietly buried under layers of newer rules that happened to benefit people who already had power. She learned to speak in front of groups without letting her voice shake, to negotiate without losing herself in the process, to listen to people the way Thessaly had once listened to kings, as if what they said actually mattered. The outer packs noticed her. They were communities of people who had been ignored so long, they had stopped expecting anything from the kingdom except more demands. When Mara showed up at their settlements, not with promises, but with questions. What do you need? What was taken from you? What would fair actually look like? They were suspicious at first, then cautious, then, slowly, something else. She settled disputes between neighboring packs that had been argued for decades. She found, buried in the old law texts, provisions that entitled the outer territories to representation at royal summits that they had never once been invited to. She wrote letters to regional leaders. She built relationships, one honest conversation at a time. They started calling her the uncrowned queen, and the name moved through the eastern provinces like wind through tall grass until it crossed the kingdom's border and reached places it was not supposed to reach. Back in the capital, Aldrich's reign was not failing. That was the cruelest part. It was simply becoming emptier. Seraphine was an excellent Luna in every measurable way. She managed court functions with precision. She negotiated trade agreements without sentiment. She represented the crown at every required occasion, always correct, always composed. She and Aldrich were polite to each other, in the way that people are polite when they have agreed, without ever saying it aloud. That warmth is not part of the arrangement. Aldrich stopped sleeping well. He stopped laughing entirely. His beta, Caius, who had grown up near the outer edges and had been quietly, separately friends with both Mara and Aldrich, before fate pulled them in different directions, watched the king move through his days like a person going through the correct motions in the wrong life. The outer packs began withdrawing cooperation. First the tributes slowed, then the trade agreements grew complicated. Then 3 of the eastern territories officially requested representation at the next regional summit, citing, with detailed precision, the exact legal provisions from the old wolf laws that someone had clearly spent years teaching them. The royal council read the request and looked at each other. Aldrich read it and went very still. He recognized the argument, not because he had ever studied those laws, but because he recognized the mind behind them. He had spent enough mornings in a forest with that mind to know how it worked. Patient, thorough, and completely unimpressed by authority, it had not seen earn itself. The border summit was held in a neutral hall at the edge of the kingdom's territory. Regional leaders from across the land filled the long table. Aldrich sat at the head, flanked by his council. He had been told that the eastern provinces would be sending a representative. He was not told it would be her. When Mara walked into that hall, Aldrich saw her before she had crossed the threshold. Something in him went completely quiet. The specific kind of quiet that happens when the world suddenly makes a kind of sense it has been refusing to make for years. She looked different. Not older exactly, steadier, like someone who had walked through a long storm and come out the other side without having lost anything that actually mattered. She wore no crown, no title on her clothing, nothing that announced her. She didn't need to. The 6 outer pack leaders who walked in behind her, all of them hardened people who trusted no one easily, arranged themselves around her like she was the sun, and they were simply acknowledging which direction the light came from. She sat down across from Aldrich. She looked up. Their eyes met. The room felt it. Nobody said anything. Mara opened her notes and began to speak. For 3 hours, she presented the case of the outer territories with the kind of calm, detailed, and utterly devastating accuracy that made it impossible to argue against without sounding either ignorant or dishonest. She did not raise her voice. She did not make it personal. She simply laid out, fact by fact, year by year, the gap between what the kingdom had promised and what it had delivered. Aldrich did not speak during her presentation. He watched her. He listened. And something inside him that had been going numb for 3 years quietly started to feel again, which was not comfortable, but it was real. The weeks that followed were hard for the kingdom, and harder for Aldrich personally. The legal withdrawal of the outer territories was formal, clean, and completely valid under the old wolf laws. The empire his father had spent a lifetime building contracted. The royal council, in one final demonstration of how little they had ever actually cared about him versus the power he represented, moved to dissolve his marriage to Seraphine on the grounds that it had failed to maintain the outer alliances it was designed to secure. Seraphine agreed without drama. She had never wanted a love story. She left the capital the same week, already moving forward, which Aldrich found he respected more than he had expected to. He was left alone in a palace that had never felt like home. Caius went to Mara with no instructions from anyone. He went because he had watched 2 people he cared about spend years being less than they were, and he had run out of patience for it. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was something she had gotten very good at. Then she went to Aldrich. She did not go to forgive him all at once, or to pick up where things had broken. She went to talk, honestly, without the weight of crowns or councils or ceremony between them. The first conversation was difficult. The second one was harder. There were things said that cost both of them. Aldrich speaking about fear and choices he could not undo. Mara speaking about grief she had spent years carrying quietly. Neither of them made it easy, because neither of them was interested in a version of this that skipped over the real parts. What happened between them, slowly and without announcement, was something like the return of a tide. Not a wave, not dramatic, just the patient and inevitable return of something that had never actually stopped being true. Aldrich made his decision in the end, with full understanding of what it cost him. He signed the formal recognition of the eastern provinces as an autonomous region, permanent and unconditional, cementing everything Mara had built, fully and legally, without exception. He reduced his own reign to give her people the protection of law rather than the uncertainty of goodwill. He did it freely. For the first time in his life, he chose a person over a crown. Mara, who had built an entire world that did not need him in it, looked at what he had given up and understood that this was not a man trying to win something back. This was a man who had finally figured out what mattered and was willing to show it in the only language that meant anything: action, costly and real. She let him in. They went back to the forest path. It was the only place that had ever been just theirs. No title, no rank, no history that anyone else had a claim on. The lavender still grew there, stubbornly, the way certain things refuse to give up on a place even after everyone has stopped looking after them. He did not ask her to be his Luna. He did not come with a speech or a ceremony. He simply stood there, without a crown for the first time in years, looking at her the way he had looked at her once before in a different life, like she was the only thing in the landscape that was actually real. "Stay," he said. Just that. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had broken something in her and in himself at the same time, who she had rebuilt herself in spite of, who she had somehow never managed to stop recognizing in the deep, quiet place inside her where the truth lived. She stayed. Not because she needed him, because she chose him, with full knowledge of who he was, who she was now, and everything that had happened between the two. That kind of choice, made with open eyes and no illusions, is rarer and stronger than anything that comes easy. The kingdom he ruled after that was smaller and quieter and completely his own. The outer pacts, over time, returned to a voluntary alliance built on trust rather than obligation. Mara led her people with the same patient strength she had always had, and the two territories grew together the way things grow when they are not forced. Slowly, steadily, and for real. She never took the title of Luna. She never needed to. The people who mattered knew exactly who she was, and Aldrich, who had once traded love for a crown and lost both, spent the rest of his life understanding exactly what he had been given back, and never, not once, taking it lightly again.